They thought I was just some wealthy rancher they could bully into submission? How adorable. When they torched my century-old barn over a ridiculous membership dispute, they had no clue that the quiet guy in the land management office actually controls every land grant decision across the entire state. Oops. They smugly assumed their precious rule book could silence me. Isn't that precious? Meanwhile, I've been quietly orchestrating the legal equivalent of a nuclear strike, building alliances with people who actually matter while they were busy measuring my grass height with rulers. Now, I'm not just reclaiming my property. I'm about to give them a masterclass in what real power looks like. Drop a comment about the most absurd HOA rule you've encountered, because I guarantee what these clipboard warriors don't know about me is about to demolish their perfectly manicured world. Grab your popcorn, folks. This revenge story gets deliciously messy. I never wanted to be a rancher. Growing up, I spent summers at my grandfather's property outside Boulder, Colorado, but my path led to a desk job in the county's land management division. I was content with my quiet life until last spring, when a lawyer's call changed everything. William, your grandfather left you the Hayes Ranch. All 15 acres, the house, the barn, everything. My grandfather Harold Hayes had left me his legacy, a century-old ranch that had been in our family for 4 generations, along with the sacred spring, a natural water source that indigenous people had once considered healing grounds. The property was beautiful, rolling pasture with mountain views, a sturdy farmhouse, and a magnificent timber barn that my great-grandfather had built with his own hands. What I didn't realize was that my grandfather's ranch had become an island of rural tranquility, surrounded by the rapidly expanding Golden Meadows development, an upscale gated community with a long-standing grudge against my family. The first sign of trouble arrived 3 days after I moved in. A cream-colored envelope with embossed lettering. Welcome to the Golden Meadows community. Inside was a letter explaining that due to recent boundary adjustments, my property now fell within their area of jurisdiction. The next day, a black SUV with the Golden Meadows logo pulled up my driveway. A woman in her late 30s stepped out, designer sunglasses perched on her head. Mr. Hayes, I'm Elizabeth Montgomery, president of the Golden Meadows Homeowners Association. Her smile didn't reach her eyes as she surveyed my grandfather's weathered farmhouse. There seems to be some confusion, I said, crossing my arms. This property isn't part of Golden Meadows. Never has been. Elizabeth's smile tightened. Actually, the county approved a boundary redrawing 5 years ago. Your grandfather was, reluctant to acknowledge it, but we hoped with new ownership we could start fresh. The name Montgomery struck a chord. My grandfather had mentioned the Montgomerys in his journals, a family that had tried to buy his land for decades, ever since Elizabeth's father lost a water rights dispute in the 1970s that nearly bankrupted him. I spent that evening digging through my grandfather's files. Among property tax records and water rights documents, I found a folder labeled Boundary Dispute. Inside was correspondence with county officials specifically exempting his property from inclusion in any surrounding developments. Another folder contained decades of legal battles with the Montgomery family, including attempts to divert the sacred spring that fed both our properties. My neighbor George Wilson, a 74-year-old former city planner, stopped by the next day with a basket of vegetables. Watch yourself with that HOA bunch. Your grandfather was the only one who stood up to them. Rest of us got swallowed up years ago. My wife Linda's rose bushes weren't the approved variety, made her tear out 30-year-old heirlooms. His disgust was evident. The Montgomerys have had a vendetta against this land ever since your grandfather refused to sell the spring rights to Elizabeth's father. Now she runs that HOA like a personal fiefdom. 3 days later, I awoke to the sound of machinery at the edge of my property. A small landscaping crew was removing sections of my grandfather's split-rail fence. I stormed out in my pajamas. What the hell do you think you're doing? The crew foreman looked uncomfortable. HOA orders, sir. This fence doesn't meet community standards. That afternoon, Elizabeth Montgomery returned, this time with Gregory Phillips, the HOA's development liaison. Mr. Hayes, Elizabeth began, her tone professionally sympathetic. We understand this transition might be difficult for you. Your grandfather was resistant to progress, but Golden Meadows has a vision for this area that will benefit everyone. Gregory nodded enthusiastically. The recreation center we're planning will be state-of-the-art, all just a stone's throw from your home. Your property values would triple. This property isn't for sale, I said firmly, and it's not part of your HOA, Before I could argue further, Gregory cleared his throat. There's also the matter of compliance issues. Your tractor is visible from the main road, your mailbox doesn't match community standards, and frankly, the barn is an eyesore, according to our architectural guidelines. My blood began to boil. That eyesore was built by my great-grandfather in 1922. It's been here a hell of a lot longer than your development. They left a 3-ring binder of regulations on my porch swing. That evening, my phone rang. It was Jerry Hoffman, my grandfather's old friend from the county records office. William, someone's been requesting all the historical documentation related to your property boundaries. And there's something else. Some of the online records don't match our paper archives. I think someone might have altered the digital boundary maps. I stared out at the barn, silhouetted against the setting sun. Next to it stood the ancient oak that marked the sacred spring, the true heart of the property, and, I suspected, Elizabeth Montgomery's real target all along. The stack of violation notices began arriving daily. Bright yellow papers detailing how my property failed to meet Golden Meadows standards. Excessive lawn height, non-conforming vehicle storage, agricultural equipment visible from the road. The fines started at $50 each, but escalated with every day of non-compliance. Meanwhile, Abigail from the land management office called with troubling news. William, I've been digging into those boundary changes. Something's not right. The official records show your property was incorporated into the development zone 5 years ago, but I can't find any notification to your grandfather or public hearing documentation, which would have been required by law. I wasn't surprised. My grandfather kept meticulous records. He had letters specifically exempting his property. Abigail's voice lowered. Those exemption documents aren't in our system. It's like they've been scrubbed. One Tuesday morning, I returned from a supply run to find a team of workers in Golden Meadows uniforms digging along my eastern property line. A large drainage pipe was being installed, cutting directly across what had always been my grandfather's land. I confronted the crew supervisor, who barely glanced at me. HOA authorization, he said, flashing a document. We're implementing required drainage improvements. The paper cited an obscure county planning statute about properties sharing watershed management responsibilities. By afternoon, they had trenched a 6-foot-wide channel that effectively cut off access to my back pasture. When I called the HOA office, I was directed to Gregory Phillips. Mr. Hayes, he said with practiced patience, all Golden Meadows properties must participate in our watershed management system. You'll be receiving an assessment of $5,000 for your share of the environmental impact fees. The next day, an official-looking notice arrived by certified mail detailing the HOA's emergency powers regarding environmental concerns. At the bottom was a note that made my stomach drop. Failure to remit payment within 30 days will result in a property lien and possible foreclosure proceedings. George Wilson became an unexpected ally, bringing me coffee each morning and filling me in on the HOA's history. Elizabeth took over 3 years ago, he explained as we sat near the sacred spring. Her family's been obsessed with this land since your grandfather won that water rights case in '73. Her father claimed the spring should have been communal property, but he really wanted to bottle and sell the water. Your grandfather proved the spring had been part of Hayes land since the 1880s and had cultural significance to the local indigenous people. Linda, George's wife, had been secretly recording HOA meetings. They've been targeting your property specifically, she confided, playing a recording where Elizabeth discussed strategic acquisition of the Hayes eyesore and finally controlling that damned spring. The most disturbing part was hearing Mayor Harold Bennett's voice offering to expedite any necessary paperwork. One morning, I discovered that my secondary access road had been blocked by concrete barriers, a sign declaring it Golden Meadows Construction Zone, no trespassing. This effectively forced me to use only my main driveway, which they monitored constantly. My research into Golden Meadows intensified. Using my knowledge of land management protocols, I requested copies of their original development permits. The HOA had been built on former agricultural land rezoned through a special county variance. Such variances typically came with conditions, usually environmental protections or public access requirements. While at the county offices, I ran into Councilman Benjamin Foster, a 61-year-old environmental advocate I'd worked with previously. William, heard you're having trouble with Golden Meadows. Not surprised. They've been skirting environmental regulations for years. That whole development was built on protected wetlands. The only reason it got approved was some questionable influence on the zoning board. As we spoke, I noticed Elizabeth's husband entering the mayor's office across the hall, thick envelope in hand. Returning home that afternoon, I received an emergency alert on my phone. The security system I'd installed showed several official-looking vehicles with county markings turning onto my driveway, followed by a truck towing construction equipment. I called Sheriff Daniel Warren while racing home. "Someone's on my property without authorization," I explained urgently. "They have construction equipment." By the time I screeched into my driveway 20 minutes later, a team of workers in county uniforms was dismantling my historic front gate. Another crew was setting up equipment near my barn. A third had begun erecting Golden Meadows Community Recreation Zone signs along my fence line. What caught my attention most was that they were positioning equipment near the Sacred Springs oak tree, the centuries-old landmark my grandfather had fought so hard to protect. Gregory Phillips stood supervising, clipboard in hand, a satisfied smile on his face. "Ah, Mr. Hayes, perfect timing. We're implementing the county-approved safety improvements to your non-compliant structures. I have all the necessary permits right here." My hand shook with rage as I snatched the documents from Gregory's hand. The permits appeared legitimate at first glance: county letterhead, official stamps, even the signature of the planning commissioner. But the owner was listed as Golden Meadows Community Trust. "These are fraudulent," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "This property is registered to William Hayes. You have no authority to be here." Gregory's smile didn't waver. "Actually, due to your failure to comply with watershed management regulations, the county has granted us emergency remediation authority. It's all perfectly legal." He gestured to the workers, who continued dismantling my gate despite my protests. I planted myself in front of a bulldozer, heading toward my barn and the Sacred Spring oak. "Stop right now, or I'm calling the sheriff." The operator looked uncertainly at Gregory, who nodded dismissively. "The sheriff's office has been notified of our activities today. Move your equipment around, Mr. Hayes. We have a schedule to maintain." I pulled out my phone and started recording, documenting everything: the workers, the equipment, Gregory's smug expression, the permits. One of the workers approached the electrical panel on the side of the barn, preparing to disconnect the power. "Don't touch that," I warned. "It's connected to the main house system." The worker looked to Gregory, who again nodded permission. As the worker began unscrewing the electrical panel, a shower of sparks suddenly erupted. He jumped back, dropping his tools. Then someone shouted, "Fire!" A small flame had caught in the dry straw near the barn's foundation. Within seconds, it spread to the weathered timber. I ran for the garden hose while shouting for someone to call the fire department. Gregory was backing away, face pale, barking orders into his phone. The workers scattered in confusion, some grabbing fire extinguishers from their trucks, others simply fleeing the scene. By the time the fire trucks arrived, the barn was fully engulfed. I stood helplessly with George and Linda Wilson, watching as firefighters battled the blaze. Inside that barn were irreplaceable family heirlooms: my great-grandfather's tools, my grandmother's hope chest, photographs and letters dating back 100 years, and worst of all, the ceremonial artifacts from the local indigenous tribe that my grandfather had promised to protect, stored safely in the barn's stone root cellar. Sheriff Daniel Warren arrived as the roof collapsed in a shower of embers. "Jesus, William, what happened here?" I explained about the unauthorized work crew and the electrical panel. When Gregory attempted to slip away to his car, Sheriff Warren intercepted him. "Not so fast, Mr. Phillips. I need a statement from everyone present." Gregory straightened his tie nervously. "This was clearly an accident during authorized county maintenance. We have all the proper documentation." Fire Chief Samuel Carter approached as the last flames were being extinguished. "I'm sorry, William. We did everything we could." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, this doesn't look like a simple accident. The fire spread too quickly, and that electrical panel shouldn't have sparked like that unless it was tampered with. I'll be conducting a full investigation." Elizabeth Montgomery's black SUV pulled up as the emergency vehicles began to depart. She emerged looking appropriately concerned in a perfectly tailored suit. "Mr. Hayes, what a terrible tragedy. I came as soon as I heard." Her sympathy sounded rehearsed. "Of course, if your property had been properly maintained according to our safety standards, this might have been prevented." The audacity stunned me into silence. She continued smoothly, "Perhaps now you'll reconsider our offer. Golden Meadows would be happy to take this troubled property off your hands." In that moment, something broke inside me. The grief over losing my grandfather's barn transformed into cold, clear rage. "Get off my property, Elizabeth, now, and take your offer with you." Her expression hardened. "You might want to reconsider your tone, Mr. Hayes. The county inspector will be evaluating this site tomorrow. Given the obvious safety hazards now present, I wouldn't be surprised if they issued a condemnation order." The next week passed in a blur of insurance adjusters, fire investigators, and mounting HOA violations. I tried filing complaints with the county, only to discover that Elizabeth's husband chaired the appeals board. My spirits hit rock bottom when a certified letter arrived declaring my property abandoned and hazardous following the fire, triggering an expedited condemnation process. I sat on my porch that evening, surrounded by violation notices and legal threats, wondering if it was even worth fighting anymore. The sun was setting over the mountains, casting long shadows across the charred remains of the barn. Something caught my eye, a glint of metal in the ashes. Investigating, I found my grandfather's old fireproof lockbox, partially melted, but intact. Inside were property deeds, water rights documents, and a small brass key labeled First National Bank, Box 623. The next morning, I visited the bank downtown. The safe deposit box contained more of my grandfather's papers, including detailed notes about his role in establishing the county's land grant system decades ago as a young man working in the planning office. Most importantly, it held records of the original conditional land grants for what was now Golden Meadows. The development sat on land that required specific environmental protections and, crucially, renewal of its conditional use permit every 20 years. According to my grandfather's meticulous records, that renewal was due in exactly 30 days. But what captured my attention most was a weathered photograph of my grandfather standing proudly by the sacred spring oak, with a handwritten note on the back. "Remember, William, they can burn our buildings, but the land remembers who its true stewards are." The realization hit me like a thunderbolt. For 15 years, I'd worked in the land management division, processing paperwork, approving permits, and administering the very system my grandfather had helped create. I'd never connected my bureaucratic job with actual power until now. Those conditional land grants were legally binding documents requiring periodic review and renewal. Review that would cross my department's desk. Taking a personal day from work, I drove to the county office and requested access to the historical land grant archives. The basement archives were a labyrinth of filing cabinets containing the county's land history. After hours of searching, I found what I needed: the original Golden Meadows development permits from 1998. The conditions were explicit. 20% of the land must remain undeveloped. Wetlands, public access trails must be maintained, and native plant species must be preserved. Most importantly, the conditional grant required renewal every 20 years, with proof of compliance with all original conditions. According to the renewal schedule, the Golden Meadows review was due to cross my desk in exactly 27 days. If they failed to demonstrate compliance with the original conditions, their land grant could be revoked or modified with new restrictions. For the first time since inheriting my grandfather's property, I felt a glimmer of hope. I called Abigail Taylor. "I need everything you can find on Golden Meadows' environmental compliance history," I explained. "Inspection reports, violation notices, anything?" Abigail was intrigued. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your barn mysteriously burning down, would it?" When I didn't immediately answer, she continued, "I'll see what I can dig up. And William, be careful, these people have connections." Her warning was timely. When I returned to work the next day, my supervisor, Director Gwynne Howard, called me into her office. "William, I received a concerning call from the mayor's office," she began, studying me over her reading glasses. "Apparently there's some conflict of interest regarding your property and the Golden Meadows development." I explained the situation: the boundary dispute, the harassment, the destruction of my barn, and the targeting of the sacred spring oak, which had cultural significance to local indigenous peoples. Gwen listened attentively, her expression growing increasingly troubled. "This is precisely why nepotism rules exist," she sighed. "But in your case, since the property was recently inherited and the conflict wasn't pre-existing when you were hired," she tapped her pen thoughtfully. "Legally, I can't remove you from processing their renewal application, unless there's a formal complaint with evidence of bias. Has there been?" "Not yet," I admitted, "but Elizabeth Montgomery has connections to the mayor. It's probably coming." Gwen's eyes narrowed. "Until then, you proceed as normal. But William, document everything. Every interaction, every piece of evidence. If this gets ugly, you'll need it." That afternoon, I received notice that my property had been scheduled for a county health inspection due to anonymous complaints. Simultaneously, an email from Abigail arrived with documentation on Golden Meadows. Her research revealed a pattern of environmental violations: wetlands filled for additional housing, protected tree species removed, toxic runoff into the watershed from their golf course. Most damning was evidence that 7 HOA board members, including Elizabeth Montgomery, had built illegal additions to their homes without proper environmental impact studies. If they applied for renewal without addressing these violations, I would have legitimate grounds to recommend denial. When I returned home that evening, I found Golden Meadows security vehicles parked along my fence line, taking photographs. One of the men approached as I pulled into my driveway. "Mr. Hayes, we're documenting safety hazards for tomorrow's health inspection." His tone was professional, but his smile suggested he was enjoying this. "Any hazards you find were created when your people burned down my barn," I replied coldly. That night, I made a decision. I knew the HOA had installed surveillance equipment in the drainage pipes on my property. Instead of removing it, I would use it against them. I purchased small wireless cameras of my own and carefully installed them inside the same access panels where I'd found their devices. Now I could monitor who checked the surveillance equipment and what they did with it. It was a risky move, but I needed to gather as much evidence as possible before the showdown I knew was coming. The next day, while the county health inspector was examining my property, I noticed Gregory Phillips and another man I didn't recognize checking the drainage pipes near my property line. My hidden cameras captured them removing memory cards from their surveillance devices and discussing what appeared to be their next steps. "Elizabeth wants him out before the renewal date," Gregory said clearly. "We've got the condemnation hearing in 2 weeks. That should do it." The other man, who I later identified as Anthony Turner, a former police officer who now worked as Golden Meadows security chief, looked uncomfortable. "This is getting out of hand, Greg. The barn was one thing, but if anyone finds those surveillance devices, we could be looking at serious charges." Over the next week, I began a methodical campaign of documentation. Using satellite imagery from the Land Management Office, I identified areas where Golden Meadows had filled in protected wetlands. I photographed non-native landscaping that violated their original agreement. I documented 7 cases of runoff pollution from their golf course. Meanwhile, I met with Councilman Benjamin Foster to share my findings about Golden Meadows' environmental violations. As one of the few local officials not in Elizabeth Montgomery's pocket, he was a valuable ally. "This is worse than I thought," he said, reviewing my documentation. "They've basically ignored every condition of their original grant, especially the requirement to preserve the indigenous cultural sites. That sacred spring on your property, it's actually mentioned specifically in their original agreement as a protected cultural landmark that they must help maintain access to for tribal ceremony." The next day brought a new escalation. I received notice that my property had been reported as abandoned after the fire, triggering an expedited condemnation process. The hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, conveniently, just before Golden Meadows land grant renewal came due. That evening, as I was updating my documentation, George Wilson knocked urgently on my door. "William, you need to see this." He led me to his property line overlooking a section of Golden Meadows. In the distance, Elizabeth Montgomery was leading a group of investors on a tour of what appeared to be a construction site. "They're breaking ground on that recreation center," George explained grimly, "on protected land they don't legally control." I recorded everything, capturing Elizabeth presenting the project as a done deal. The next morning, I received an urgent call from Abigail Taylor. "William, you need to get down here immediately. I found something you won't believe." When I arrived at the county office, she showed me property maps and emails she had recovered from the system archives, showing how Elizabeth and Gregory had manipulated flood zone maps to target my land. "They've been planning this for years," Abigail said, her voice tense with anger. "They created a false watershed issue to justify claiming jurisdiction over your property." Armed with evidence of fraud and environmental violations, I needed a strategic approach. Elizabeth had too many connections in local government for a frontal assault. Instead, I would build a case methodically, gather allies, and strike when the timing was perfect. First, I reached out to Heather Jackson, an investigative journalist with the regional newspaper. Unlike the local paper, her publication wasn't dependent on real estate advertising. "I can't promise anything," she cautioned when we met at a coffee shop outside town, "but if your evidence is solid, this could be a significant story." I shared copies of the altered boundary maps and emails, along with photographs of environmental violations. Heather's eyes widened as she reviewed the documents. This goes beyond HOA overreach. This is systematic fraud and corruption. She agreed to begin investigating, promising to hold publication until we had the complete picture. Next, I contacted retired Judge Albert Graham, a Golden Meadows resident known for his integrity. At 78, he had lost none of his sharp intellect. I moved here for peace and quiet in my retirement, he explained as we sat in his study. Instead, I found myself living under a petty dictatorship. As he examined the documentation I'd gathered, his judicial demeanor cracked slightly. This is outrageous. They've been manipulating county records, violating environmental protections, and apparently destroying private property to achieve their aims. The judge removed his glasses slowly. Mr. Hayes, what you have here is grounds for not only civil action, but potentially criminal charges. How can I help? His support was a turning point. As a respected former judge, his voice would carry weight with county officials, who might otherwise dismiss my claims. I need to build a coalition, I explained. People willing to stand up when the moment comes. The judge nodded thoughtfully. I believe I can assist with that. Several residents here are increasingly disturbed by the HOA's methods. We just needed evidence and leadership. Meanwhile, I continued documenting Golden Meadows violations while appearing to cooperate with their escalating harassment. At work, I maintained a professional demeanor while preparing for their land grant renewal. Director Howard kept me informed of behind-the-scenes pressure from the mayor's office. They're pushing for your recusal, she confided. So far, I've held them off, but they're escalating to the county commissioner. I check my hidden cameras daily, collecting footage of Gregory and Anthony making regular visits to their surveillance equipment. Most importantly, I captured Elizabeth herself instructing them to make sure Hayes is under constant surveillance. This was a clear privacy violation that would add weight to my case. What surprised me most was when Anthony Turner lingered after one such visit, looking troubled. He pulled out his phone and took photographs of the drainage system, shaking his head. This isn't right, I heard him mutter. I made a mental note. Anthony might be having second thoughts about his role in this scheme. As the renewal date approached, I received an unexpected visitor at my office. Natalie Phillips, Gregory's wife. She seemed nervous, glancing over her shoulder as she entered. Mr. Hayes, I don't have much time. Gregory can't know I'm here. She placed a USB drive on my desk. These are internal HOA emails and meeting minutes from the last 3 years. I didn't know what they were doing until recently. When they destroyed your barn, she faltered. That was deliberate, wasn't it? I nodded slowly. We believe so, though proving it has been challenging. Natalie squared her shoulders. Well, these might help. There's discussion about removing obstacles on your property, strategies for forcing you out. Elizabeth even jokes about how convenient a fire would be. I stared at the small drive, potentially containing the evidence I needed to prove arson. Why are you doing this? I asked. Natalie's expression hardened. They destroyed my garden last month, roses I'd been growing for 20 years. Non-conforming plant species, they said. But the real reason? I complained when they cut down the ancient oak by the community center, another sacred indigenous site they were supposed to protect. My daughter is part Native American through my first husband, and that tree meant something to her heritage. The condemnation hearing for my property was scheduled for the following Monday, just 3 days before Golden Meadows' land grant renewal would cross my desk. Over the weekend, I prepared meticulously, organizing all my evidence with my brother Philip's legal guidance. On Sunday evening, the developers behind the Recreation Center project, Hudson and Brooks, announced a $20 million investment in Golden Meadows' Community Enhancement Initiative. The timing wasn't coincidental. They were attempting to create momentum and political pressure ahead of both hearings. That night, I received a text message from an unknown number. Security Office, South End, tomorrow 8 a.m. It was cryptic, but I suspected it might be from Anthony Turner. The next morning, I drove past the Golden Meadows security office at the appointed time. Anthony Turner was outside, pretending to check something on his vehicle. As I drove past, he slipped an envelope under his windshield wiper. I circled back a few minutes later and retrieved it after he'd gone inside. The envelope contained printed emails between Elizabeth and Gregory, discussing how the electrical panel had been prepared before the work crew arrived at my barn, plus a handwritten note. My nephew was at the Sacred Spring ceremony last year. This has gone too far. Monday morning arrived with dark clouds threatening rain. Fitting weather for the condemnation hearing. I arrived at the county building to find Elizabeth Montgomery and Mayor Bennett huddled in conversation outside the hearing room. They fell silent as I approached, Elizabeth offering a thin smile. "Mr. Hayes, I do hope this process isn't too difficult for you. Sometimes letting go is the healthiest option." I matched her false sympathy with my own. "I appreciate your concern, Elizabeth. I've been doing a lot of research lately into property boundaries, environmental regulations, surveillance laws, fascinating subjects." Something flickered in her eyes, the first hint of uncertainty I'd seen. The hearing room was packed, hearing board members, local officials, and many Golden Meadows residents I didn't recognize. Judge Graham nodded slightly from the back row. When my turn came to respond to the condemnation proposal, I approached the podium calmly. "Members of the board, I believe this hearing is not about safety at all, but about a systematic attempt to seize control of my property through fraudulent means." A murmur ran through the room. I placed a stack of documents on the table. "I have evidence that Golden Meadows HOA has engaged in boundary manipulation, environmental violations, and potentially criminal activities, including destruction of property and illegal surveillance." Elizabeth's composure finally cracked. "This is absurd. Mr. Hayes is clearly bitter about losing his unsafe structures and is retaliating with baseless accusations." County Commissioner Allison Wright, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. "Are you suggesting, Ms. Montgomery, that the satellite imagery showing wetland destruction, the altered boundary documents, and the surveillance equipment are all fabrications?" Elizabeth blinked in surprise. What surveillance equipment?" I produced photographs of the devices found in the drainage pipes, installed on my property without consent and designed to monitor my activities. "A clear violation of privacy laws." The commissioner turned to the county attorney. "I believe we need to suspend this condemnation proceeding pending investigation of these allegations." Mayor Bennett began to protest, but Commissioner Wright cut him off. "Furthermore, I'm ordering a full review of all Golden Meadows permits and compliance history before any renewal applications are processed." Elizabeth's face had gone pale. As the hearing adjourned, she rushed out, phone already to her ear. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The headline of Wednesday's regional newspaper read, "Development Fraud. Ocho accused of document falsification, environmental crimes." Heather Jackson's investigative piece laid out the evidence methodically. Altered boundary maps, filled wetlands, surveillance operations, and suspicious circumstances surrounding my barn fire. By mid-morning, local television crews were parked outside the Golden Meadows entrance, requesting statements from Elizabeth Montgomery and the HOA board. Across town, at an emergency meeting of the county commission, the Golden Meadows land grant renewal application was formally suspended pending investigation. I sat quietly in the back of the chamber as Commissioner Wright announced a comprehensive review of all development permits issued during Mayor Bennett's administration. The mayor himself was conspicuously absent, having called in sick that morning. Gregory Phillips attempted to represent the HOA's interests, but appeared nervous and unprepared. "These allegations are completely unfounded," he insisted without conviction. "Golden Meadows has always operated in full compliance with county regulations." Commissioner Wright was unimpressed. "Mr. Phillips, we have satellite imagery showing protected wetlands that were filled for construction of your golf course expansion. Would you care to explain how that constitutes full compliance?" Gregory tugged at his collar. "I would need to consult our environmental impact reports." "The same reports," the commissioner continued, "that appear to have been altered after approval. Those reports, the commission chamber had filled with Golden Meadows residents, many hearing these allegations for the first time." Murmurs of discontent spread through the crowd. Judge Graham stood to address the commission. "As a resident of Golden Meadows and former county judge, I request a full audit of HOA finances. Many of us have paid substantial special assessments for environmental compliance that now appears questionable at best." His intervention sparked a chorus of agreement from other residents. The commission voted unanimously to expand their investigation to include HOA financial practices. Outside the chamber, I was approached by Hudson and Brooks representatives, the developers who had announced the $20 million recreation center investment. "Mr. Hayes," the senior partner began uncertainly, "in light of recent revelations, we're reconsidering our position on the Golden Meadows expansion." I nodded, understanding. Probably wise. The land grant renewal is unlikely to proceed without major modifications and penalties. He glanced around nervously. We were assured all permits were in order and environmental concerns addressed. Our company has a sustainability commitment that appears to have been compromised. I sensed an opportunity. There are ways to develop responsibly. My grandfather believed in balanced growth that preserved natural resources. The developers exchanged looks. Perhaps we should discuss alternative approaches that would satisfy both community needs and environmental protections. This was an unexpected opening. Potential allies from what had been the opposition camp. That afternoon, Sheriff Warren requested I come to his office. When I arrived, Fire Chief Carter was waiting with him, along with a county arson investigator. "William," the sheriff began, "we've completed our investigation of the barn fire." He pushed a folder across his desk. "Based on witness statements, physical evidence, and some recently acquired video footage, we've determined the fire was the result of deliberate negligence during unauthorized work on your property." My heart pounded. "Do you have enough to press charges?" The fire chief nodded grimly. "We've got something better than our determination." He opened a laptop and played a video, security footage from Linda Wilson's garden camera, that captured a clear view of my property. In the video, Elizabeth Montgomery and Gregory Phillips could be seen directing workers to remove fire suppression equipment from near the barn before the accident. Elizabeth's voice was clearly audible. "Make sure there's nothing to stop a spark from catching. An old structure like this is just waiting for an electrical mishap." The evidence was damning. Sheriff Warren closed the laptop. "We're filing criminal charges for destruction of property, fraud, and reckless endangerment. We've already contacted Ms. Montgomery and Mr. Phillips to arrange surrender of their passports." I sat back, emotions churning. After months of feeling helpless against their machinations, justice was finally within reach. What happens now? Sheriff Warren's expression was professional but satisfied. "Now we follow the evidence wherever it leads. The surveillance equipment, the document falsification, the financial irregularities, this goes beyond HOA overreach into criminal conspiracy. Mayor Bennett has already been served with a subpoena for his communications with Golden Meadows leadership. As I left the sheriff's office, my phone buzzed with a text from Abigail. "Turn on Channel 12 now." I found a coffee shop with a television just in time to see Elizabeth Montgomery being escorted from the Golden Meadows clubhouse by sheriff's deputies, her expression a mixture of shock and fury. Gregory Phillips followed, head bowed, avoiding the camera. The following day, I presented my findings on Golden Meadows environmental violations to the Land Management Division. Director Howard had arranged for environmental experts, county legal counsel, and Commissioner Wright to attend. My presentation was comprehensive. Satellite imagery showing wetland destruction, water quality reports indicating contaminant leaching, wildlife impact studies revealing habitat loss, and documentation of protected species removal. Based on these findings, I concluded, I recommend denial of Golden Meadows land grant renewal until all violations are remediated and a comprehensive environmental restoration plan is implemented. The room was silent as my colleagues absorbed the evidence. Mr. Wright finally spoke. "This is the most comprehensive documentation of environmental violations I've seen in 20 years of public service. Mr. Hayes, despite personal attacks and the destruction of your property, you've maintained professional standards throughout this process. The county owes you a debt of gratitude and an apology." That evening, a convoy of cars made its way up my driveway, Golden Meadows residents, led by Judge Graham and the Wilsons. For a moment I tensed, wondering if this was another confrontation. Instead, they came bearing food, drinks, and a proposition. "We're forming a new homeowners association," Judge Graham explained, as people set up an impromptu picnic near the remains of my barn, own that respects property rights, environmental protections, and community input. "We'd like your guidance on structuring it properly," Linda Wilson added. "Those of us who've been here longest remember when this was all farmland. Your grandfather was right to protect his piece of it. We should have fought harder for ours." As the sun set over the mountains, casting long shadows across my property, neighbors who had been strangers, even adversaries, just weeks ago shared a meal and began planning a different kind of community, one based on respect rather than control, preservation rather than exploitation. George raised his glass in a toast to William Hayes, who reminded us that standing up for what's right is never easy, but always necessary. The county courthouse was packed for the hearing on Golden Meadows land grant renewal. 3 months had passed since the barn fire, months filled with investigations, depositions, and revelations of corruption reaching into the highest levels of county government. Mayor Bennett had resigned amid allegations of bribery and evidence tampering. Gregory Phillips had accepted a plea deal testifying against Elizabeth Montgomery in exchange for reduced charges. Elizabeth herself sat at the defendant's table, her designer outfit replaced by subdued business attire, her imperious attitude diminished but not entirely gone. The land grant hearing would determine the fate of the entire Golden Meadows development, whether it would continue under new leadership with modified conditions, or whether more drastic measures would be required to address the environmental damage. As the Land Management Division's representative, I presented our findings and recommendations. The violations documented are serious but not irreparable, I explained. With proper remediation, restoration of wetlands, removal of illegal structures, and implementation of water quality protections, Golden Meadows can be brought into compliance. Commissioner Wright, now acting as interim mayor following Bennett's resignation, led the questioning. Mr. Hayes, given the history of violations, what oversight do you recommend to ensure compliance moving forward? I'd given this considerable thought. I recommend establishment of an environmental compliance committee with representatives from county departments, environmental experts, and community members. Quarterly inspections, public reporting of findings, and substantial financial penalties for any future violations. Judge Graham, representing the new Homeowners Association, endorsed the proposal. The residents of Golden Meadows support these measures. We've already begun voluntary remediation efforts and established our own environmental stewardship program. Elizabeth Montgomery, given an opportunity to speak, attempted one last defense. These so-called violations were standard industry practices. Every development in the county has similar issues if subjected to this level of scrutiny. Commissioner Wright's response was measured but firm. Then perhaps every development should be scrutinized this thoroughly. Environmental protections aren't suggestions, Ms. Montgomery. They're legal requirements. The Commission's decision was unanimous. Golden Meadows land grant would be renewed, but with stringent new conditions, substantial remediation requirements, and close oversight. Additionally, all properties improperly annexed, including my grandfather's ranch, were officially removed from HOA jurisdiction. The boundary lines were restored to their original legal designations. As an added measure, my property received historic designation, protecting it from future development pressures. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered for statements. I kept mine brief, focusing on moving forward rather than dwelling on past injustices. Today's decision affirms that environmental protections matter, that property rights matter, and that no one, no matter how wealthy or connected, is above the law. When asked about Elizabeth Montgomery, who faced potential jail time for her role in the barn fire and subsequent cover-up, I simply said the legal system will determine appropriate consequences. My concern is rebuilding what was destroyed and ensuring nothing like this happens to other property owners. The criminal proceedings moved more slowly than the civil ones. Elizabeth was eventually convicted of criminal negligence, fraud, and conspiracy, receiving a 3-year sentence with 2 years suspended. Gregory Phillips received probation in exchange for his testimony and cooperation. The developers Hudson and Brooks approached me with a revised proposal, not for tennis courts or a recreation center, but for a conservation easement and educational facility, highlighting sustainable land management practices. We've reconsidered our approach to development in this region, their representative explained. Your grandfather's vision of balanced growth actually aligns with emerging market trends toward environmental responsibility. It was a surprising but welcome shift. Though I remained cautious, the partnership offered a way to create something positive from the conflict, a demonstration project showing how development and conservation could coexist. That spring, 1 year after inheriting my grandfather's property, I stood watching as volunteers helped raise the frame of a new barn. Built on the foundation of the original structure, but with modern, sustainable materials, it represented both continuity and renewal. George and Linda Wilson were there, along with Judge Graham, Abigail Taylor, and dozens of community members, some from Golden Meadows, others from surrounding property. Director Howard had approved my proposal for a new position within the Land Management Division, Environmental Compliance Director, allowing me to implement the lessons learned from the Golden Meadows case across the county. The insurance settlement from the barn fire, combined with a civil judgment against the former HOA leadership, provided funds to establish a legal aid fund for homeowners facing similar battles with predatory association. While the volunteers worked, Councilman Foster approached with news. The Hayes Protection Act passed unanimously this morning, he announced proudly. The legislation, named in honor of my grandfather but inspired by my fight, strengthened homeowner rights against HOA overreach, established environmental accountability for developments, and created a transparent system for land grant review. It was a fitting legacy for a man who had spent his life protecting his small piece of Colorado. As the day wound down and the volunteers departed, I found myself alone by the partially completed barn. Kneeling in the soft earth nearby, I carefully planted a sapling, an apple tree grown from cuttings of my grandfather's original orchard. As I patted the soil around its tender roots, I uncovered something half-buried, a tarnished metal box. Inside was a perfectly preserved family photograph from the 1920s. My great-grandfather standing proudly before the original barn on its completion day. His wife and children gathered around him, faces shining with pride. Somehow it had survived the fire, protected in its metal casing. I stood slowly, the photograph in one hand, the other resting on the rough timber of the new barn. "This land has always been worth fighting for," I said softly to the mountains, the setting sun, the memory of generations who had worked this soil. "And now it always will be." In the distance, the lights of Golden Meadows began to twinkle as evening fell, but now they seemed less like an encroaching threat and more like distant stars, part of a larger landscape where there was room for farms and developments, for history and progress, for individual rights and community responsibility. The battle had been painful, the losses real, but standing there in the gathering dusk, I felt my grandfather's presence and his approval. Sometimes the quietest person in the room indeed holds all the cards. Sometimes all it takes to change an unjust system is one person willing to stand their ground, and the wisdom to know which ground is worth standing on.
Another wild tale courtesy of QA Stories. If your jaw's on the floor, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay shocked.